20 years ago, a 22-year-old avid hiker in Delaware vanished after a weekend trek. Leaving her family in torment, police suspected an accidental fall since her car was never found. But with dense woods and no clear trail markers, the investigation eventually hit a dead end. Yet over the years, Nora's mother never gave up, keeping her porch light burning every night, a beacon for her daughter's return, until advanced DNA testing emerged. A detail overlooked in 2005 suddenly revealed a chilling truth, shaking the close-knit town and changing the course of the case forever. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke on September 17, 2005, as golden sunlight filtered through the canopy of Brandywine Creek State Park. Delaware's rolling hills wore their fall colors like a painter's masterpiece, crimson and amber leaves carpeting the familiar trails that wound through ancient oak and maple groves. The temperature hovered at a perfect 62 degrees, ideal hiking weather that drew outdoor enthusiasts from across the Delaware Valley. Nora Wright had been looking forward to this hike all week. At 22, she possessed an infectious energy that radiated from her bright hazel eyes and quick smile. Standing 5'6" with shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire, Nora had the lean build of someone who spent her free time exploring nature's hidden corners. She worked part-time at Chapter and Verse, a cozy bookstore in nearby Newark, while finishing her degree in environmental science at the University of Delaware. Her coworkers knew her as the girl who could recommend the perfect novel, while planning weekend adventures in the same breath. She had this way of making everything seem possible, her roommate Sarah would later recall. Nora would come home from a 10-hour shift at the bookstore, grab her hiking boots, and still have energy to climb mountains. On this particular Saturday, Nora had chosen the Brandywine Trail, a moderate 3-mile loop she'd completed dozens of times. The path meandered alongside the creek, past historic mill ruins, and through groves where early settlers once walked. She knew every bend, every fallen log that served as a natural bridge, every clearing where deer grazed in the evening light. Her mother, Patricia Wright, had grown accustomed to these solo expeditions, though they always triggered a flutter of maternal worry. "Be careful, honey," Patricia had said that morning, watching Nora lace up her well-worn hiking boots in the kitchen of their modest colonial home. "And call me when you get back to the car." "I always do, Mom," Nora had replied, shouldering her small day pack containing water, granola bars, and the digital camera she used to document interesting plants and rock formations for her studies. "I'll be home before dark. Maybe we can watch a movie tonight." Patricia Wright smiled at the memory of that conversation, the last words they would ever exchange. At 3:47 p.m., Nora's silver Honda Civic was logged into the park's entry system by Ranger Thompson, who noticed the young woman's familiar wave as she drove toward the main trailhead. Security cameras captured her walking toward the trail entrance at 4:02 p.m., her red windbreaker bright against the muted tones of the forest. The sun set early that September evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. By 6:30 p.m., park rangers began their closing routines, checking for stragglers and securing facilities for the night. But Nora's car never passed the exit checkpoint. Patricia Wright felt the first prick of anxiety at 7:15 p.m. when her daughter's usual check-in call didn't come. By 8:00 p.m. she was pacing the kitchen, her phone clutched in increasingly sweaty palms. At 8:30 p.m. she called the park's emergency line. "My daughter always calls," she told the ranger who answered. "Something's wrong." Nora would never stay out this late without calling. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees by the time park rangers began their preliminary search at 9:20 p.m. Flashlight beams danced through the darkness like fireflies, cutting through the fog that had begun to rise from the creek. But the trails yielded nothing. No sign of an injured hiker, no abandoned backpack, no trace of Nora Wright. What made this disappearance truly baffling was the absence of her vehicle. Missing hikers typically left behind cars at trailheads, suggesting accidents or medical emergencies in the wilderness. But Nora's silver Civic had vanished as completely as she had, leaving investigators to grapple with a puzzle that defied conventional missing person protocols. By morning, what started as worry became a full-scale search. Dawn broke gray and drizzling on September 18, 2005, casting Brandywine Creek State Park in muted tones that matched the somber mood of the gathering search teams. The overnight fog had thickened into a persistent mist that clung to the trees like spiderwebs, reducing visibility and making the familiar trails feel alien and threatening. Patricia Wright hadn't slept, spending the dark hours calling Nora's friends, checking local hospitals, and driving the back roads between the park and their home, hoping to spot the silver Honda's distinctive dented rear bumper. State Police Sergeant Maria Santos arrived at the park's command center before sunrise, her boots crunching through the wet leaves as she surveyed the expanding operation. At 43, Santos had worked missing person cases for over a decade, but something about Nora Wright's disappearance felt different from the start. The missing vehicle complicated everything, transforming what should have been a straightforward wilderness search into something far more complex and troubling. In 20 years of hiking, I've never seen anything like this, Ranger Thompson told Santos as they studied topographical maps in the mobile command unit. Hikers get lost, they get hurt, but they don't just vanish with their cars. The trails don't connect to any roads except our main entrance. The initial search grid covered 3 square miles of dense woodland, focusing on the Brandywine Trail and its connecting paths. Delaware State Police deployed K-9 units at 6:30 a.m., their German shepherds straining at leashes as they picked up Nora's scent from clothing Patricia had brought from home. The dogs tracked the trail for approximately half a mile before losing the scent near a creek crossing where dozens of other hikers had passed in recent days. Overhead, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley as National Guard pilots swept back and forth in precise patterns, their thermal imaging cameras scanning for heat signatures in the gray expanse below. But the equipment, state-of-the-art for 2005, struggled with the foggy conditions and dense canopy that filtered even the infrared spectrum. "We've got about 40 volunteers suiting up for the ground search," announced Captain James Mitchell, the incident commander, as more cars arrived in the parking lot. Word had spread through Newark's tight-knit community overnight, and by 8 a.m., nearly 60 people had gathered to help find Nora Wright. College students from her environmental science program stood alongside longtime park visitors who remembered the friendly young woman from previous hikes. Patricia Wright moved through the crowd like a ghost, clutching missing person flyers that featured Nora's graduation photo, capped slightly askew, that brilliant smile that could light up any room. Her hands trembled as she stapled the papers to bulletin boards and handed them to volunteers, each interaction requiring enormous effort as she fought back waves of panic. "She's an experienced hiker," Patricia kept repeating to anyone who would listen, her voice growing hoarse from a night of crying and calling. "Nora knows these trails like her own backyard. She wouldn't get lost. Something happened to her." The search team spread through the forest in coordinated lines. Volunteers linked arm to arm as they swept through underbrush and ravines. They called Nora's name until their voices echoed off the valley walls, the sound bouncing back empty and hollow. Every overturned log, every shallow cave, every depression where an injured person might seek shelter was thoroughly examined. Cell phone technology in 2005 offered limited assistance compared to modern tracking capabilities. Sprint customer service confirmed that Nora's phone had last pinged a tower near the park at 4:15 p.m. the previous day, but triangulation methods were primitive and coverage in rural areas remained spotty. The digital breadcrumb trail that might have led to answers simply didn't exist yet. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the search expanded to include nearby roads and residential areas. Detectives canvassed local businesses, showing Nora's photograph to gas station attendants, restaurant workers, and shopkeepers, hoping someone had seen the silver Honda or its distinctive environmental science bumper stickers. "We're treating this as a missing person case with suspicious circumstances," Sergeant Santos announced at the 4:00 p.m. briefing. "The absence of both victim and vehicle suggests this may not be a simple hiking accident." Family members gathered at Patricia's home that evening, transforming the quiet colonial into an impromptu command center. Phone trees activated, reaching out to extended family networks and college connections across multiple states. Someone suggested checking Nora's email, and social media accounts for clues about her mental state or possible threats, but her digital footprint revealed nothing unusual, just the normal concerns of a busy college student juggling work and studies. As night fell for the second time, Patricia Wright stood on her front porch, staring into the darkness toward the distant tree line where Brandywine Creek State Park lay hidden. The September air had turned cold, making her breath visible in small puffs as she wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. Almost without conscious thought, she reached for the porch light switch, flooding the front yard with yellow light. "In case she comes home," Patricia whispered to her sister Linda, who had driven up from Maryland to provide support. "She needs to know we're waiting." But despite massive efforts, the trail grew colder each passing day. The search for Nora Wright intensified over the following week, transforming Brandywine Creek State Park into a staging ground for one of Delaware's most extensive missing person operations. Command tents sprouted like mushrooms across the main parking area, their canvas walls flapping in the autumn wind as coordinators managed an increasingly complex investigation that seemed to defy logical explanation. Detective Ray Kowalski had seen his share of missing hikers during 15 years with the Delaware State Police, but nothing quite like this. Typically, wilderness disappearances followed predictable patterns. Hikers strayed from marked trails, suffered injuries, or encountered sudden weather changes. But Nora Wright's case broke every rule in the missing person playbook. "She didn't just vanish," Kowalski muttered to his partner as they studied aerial photographs spread across a folding table. "She vanished along with a 2-ton vehicle." The search grid expanded daily, encompassing nearly 10 square miles of Delaware's most challenging terrain. Dense thickets of mountain laurel and wild rhododendron created natural barriers that could hide a car for decades, while seasonal streams carved deep gullies perfect for concealing evidence. Every abandoned quarry, every forgotten logging road, every depression capable of swallowing a Honda Civic received thorough attention from search teams working in methodical patterns. Advanced sonar equipment arrived on day 4, operated by volunteer divers from the Chesapeake Bay Recovery Team. They systematically swept Brandywine Creek's deeper pools, their underwater cameras revealing nothing more sinister than rusted shopping carts and decades of accumulated debris. The murky water and thick silt challenged even experienced divers, forcing them to work primarily by feel in conditions where visibility dropped to zero within arm's reach. "The creek runs for miles through this park," explained dive team leader Marcus Webb, his wetsuit dripping as he emerged from another fruitless search. "If a car went in during high water, spring floods could have carried parts downstream or buried them under tons of sediment." GPS technology in 2005 remained primitive compared to modern standards, requiring expensive equipment that only law enforcement agencies could afford. The consumer devices available to hikers offered accuracy measured in dozens of yards, rather than feet, making precise location tracking nearly impossible in dense forest conditions. Search teams relied on compass bearings and topographical maps, marking cleared areas with bright orange ribbon that soon decorated the landscape like abandoned party decorations. Patricia Wright maintained her vigil at the command post, arriving each morning with thermoses of coffee and homemade sandwiches for the volunteers who had taken unpaid time off work to search for her daughter. She learned the names of canine handlers, memorized the radio call signs of helicopter pilots, and could identify the sound of each search vehicle by its engine note alone. Mrs. Wright would be there before dawn, setting up the coffee station, recalled volunteer coordinator Janet Mills. She never asked about the search results directly. "I think she was afraid of what we might tell her, but you could see in her eyes that she was hanging on every radio transmission, every helicopter pass." The German shepherds deployed in the search possessed remarkable capabilities, their sensitive noses capable of detecting human scent days after exposure. But the dogs faced significant challenges in terrain that had hosted thousands of visitors over the years. Scent trails layered and overlapped like invisible highways, creating confusion that even the most experienced handlers struggled to interpret. "Duke's got something," announced handler Sarah Martinez on day 6, as her 5-year-old German shepherd suddenly changed direction near the park's eastern boundary. The dog's body language shifted from methodical searching to focused tracking. his tail rigid as he followed an invisible trail deeper into the forest. For 30 minutes, Duke led the team through increasingly dense undergrowth before losing the scent at a rocky outcropping, where a seasonal stream had washed away all traces. Helicopter thermal imaging proved equally challenging in the dense canopy that filtered heat signatures and created false positives from sun-warmed rocks and decomposing vegetation. Pilots flying grid patterns reported dozens of anomalies that ground teams dutifully investigated, finding nothing more significant than deer beds and abandoned camping equipment. The investigation's scope expanded beyond the park boundaries as detectives considered increasingly disturbing possibilities. Traffic cameras along nearby highways were reviewed, though coverage remained sparse in rural Delaware. License plate readers, that would become standard equipment within a decade, simply didn't exist yet, leaving investigators to rely on witness accounts and manual records that proved frustratingly incomplete. "We're working with 205 technology to solve a 2005 problem," Detective Kowalski explained to Patricia during a late evening briefing. "But that means we're limited by what was available then. No cell phone tracking, minimal surveillance coverage, and search techniques that haven't changed much since then." Local businesses cooperated fully, providing security footage from the few cameras that existed and allowing investigators to interview employees about potential sightings. But small-town Delaware in 2005 operated on trust and familiarity rather than surveillance, leaving vast gaps in the digital record that might have provided crucial clues. As September turned to October, the weather began working against search efforts. Early morning frost made ground searches treacherous, while shorter days reduced the effective search window. Trees shed their leaves in earnest, carpeting the forest floor with a thick layer that could hide crucial evidence until spring. The command post that had bustled with activity gradually began to shrink as volunteer enthusiasm waned and other emergencies demanded attention. Radio chatter that once filled the air with constant updates grew sporadic, then intermittent, then eerily quiet except for routine check-ins. Yet no trace of Nora or her car was ever found. The disappearance of Nora Wright sent ripples through Delaware's tight-knit communities, transforming coffee shop conversations and church gatherings into impromptu strategy sessions for amateur detectives. At Murphy's Diner in downtown Newark, where Nora had been a regular customer, owner Pete Murphy found himself at the center of increasingly elaborate theories about what might have happened to the young woman who always ordered blueberry pancakes and asked about his grandchildren. "Everyone had an opinion," Murphy recalled years later, wiping down the same counter where Nora used to sit with her environmental science textbooks. "Some folks thought she'd run off with a boyfriend nobody knew about. Others were convinced something terrible happened in those woods. But the ones who really knew Nora, we knew she wouldn't just disappear without a word." The University of Delaware campus, where Nora had been pursuing her degree, became a focal point for organized search efforts and increasingly wild speculation. Student volunteers organized weekend expeditions to scour areas beyond the official search perimeter, armed with nothing more than enthusiasm and a collective determination to find their missing classmate. Environmental science professor Dr. Angela Morrison, who had served as Nora's academic advisor, found herself fielding questions from students, parents, and media representatives, seeking insight into her former students' state of mind. Nora was excited about her senior thesis project on water quality in Delaware's state parks, Dr. Morrison explained to concerned parents at an emergency faculty meeting. She had every reason to look forward to the future. But alongside genuine concern, darker whispers began circulating through the community grapevine. Some questioned whether Nora's frequent solo hiking trips masked something more troubling: secret meetings, hidden relationships, or involvement with people her family didn't know about. These theories gained traction in the absence of concrete evidence, feeding on the natural human tendency to fill informational voids with speculation. Local law enforcement found themselves overwhelmed by tips ranging from genuinely helpful to completely bizarre. The tip line established by Delaware State Police received over 300 calls in the first 2 weeks, each requiring investigation and follow-up. Psychics from as far away as California contacted authorities, claiming to have received visions of Nora's location, while conspiracy theorists suggested everything from alien abduction to government cover-ups. "We investigated every credible lead," Detective Kowalski emphasized during press briefings that grew increasingly tense as days passed without progress. "But we also had to separate legitimate information from well-meaning speculation and outright fantasy." One early lead seemed particularly promising when Jennifer Mathis, a Delaware Department of Transportation worker, reported seeing a silver Honda Civic parked along Route 1. The vehicle had been approximately 3 miles from Brandywine Creek State Park, positioned in a way that suggested mechanical problems or an emergency stop. "I remember thinking the driver might need help," Mathis told investigators. "But there was nobody around the car, and I was running late for my shift. I figured they'd found a ride or called for assistance." Police immediately canvassed the area, interviewing residents and business owners about any unusual activity that weekend. They discovered that the Delaware State Police had no record of emergency calls or abandoned vehicle reports from that location, deepening the mystery rather than providing answers. The investigation expanded to include Nora's personal relationships, though her social circle proved frustratingly small and transparent. Roommate Sarah Peterson submitted to extensive interviews, providing investigators with detailed accounts of Nora's daily routines, study habits, and social activities. "Nora was pretty much an open book," Sarah explained. "She studied, worked at the bookstore, and hiked on weekends. She wasn't seeing anyone seriously, and she definitely didn't have any secrets worth disappearing over." Co-workers at Chapter and Verse painted a similar picture of a dedicated, reliable employee who showed up on time, worked extra shifts when needed, and got along well with customers and colleagues alike. Store manager Tom Bradley provided security footage from the shop's single camera, showing Nora's normal interactions during her final shift on September. "She was making plans for next week," Bradley recalled, talking about ordering new environmental science books for the college section. "People don't make work plans if they're planning to run away." Polygraph examinations were administered to family members, close friends, and anyone who had regular contact with Nora during her final weeks. The results consistently indicated truthfulness, gradually eliminating the possibility that people close to her were concealing information about her disappearance. As October arrived with its crisp mornings and earlier sunsets, community vigils became regular events. St. Mary's Catholic Church, where the Wright family had worshipped for decades, hosted weekly prayer services that drew standing-room-only crowds. Candles flickered in the autumn darkness as voices rose in unison, singing hymns that carried across Newark's quiet residential streets. "The whole town was holding its breath," remembered longtime resident Mary Kellerman, who attended every vigil despite never having met Nora personally. "It was like we were all waiting for her to walk through the church doors and tell us this was all some terrible mistake." Local businesses displayed Nora's missing person poster in windows and on bulletin boards, keeping her face visible as autumn tourists and University of Delaware students continued their daily routines. The photograph, Nora's graduation picture with that radiant smile, became an unofficial symbol of the community's determination not to forget. But unity soon turned into suspicion. Detective Ray Kowalski's office had transformed into a shrine to frustration by November 2005. Walls covered with maps, photographs, and timeline charts that seemed to mock every investigative technique he'd learned during his 15-year career. The Nora Wright case file had grown to encompass 3 thick binders, each page representing another lead that had evaporated under scrutiny, another theory that had crumbled when confronted with facts. "This isn't how missing person cases work," Kowalski muttered to his partner, Detective Lisa Chen, as they reviewed the latest batch of witness statements. "People don't just dematerialize along with their vehicles. There should be evidence: skid marks, broken glass, disturbed vegetation, something." The lack of physical evidence challenged every protocol in the Delaware State Police Investigative Handbook. Modern forensic science in 2005 could work miracles with microscopic DNA samples and trace evidence. But investigators needed something to analyze first: the Brandywine Creek State Park crime scene. If it even was a crime scene, had yielded nothing more substantial than footprints from search team volunteers and tire tracks from Park Service vehicles. Technology limitations hampered the investigation at every turn. Cell tower data, which would become crucial in future missing person cases, offered only approximate location information, with accuracy measured in miles rather than feet. The GPS coordinates from Nora's final phone ping covered an area of nearly 4 square miles, encompassing not just the park, but surrounding residential neighborhoods and commercial districts. "We're working with stone knives and bearskins compared to what investigators have today," Detective Chen observed, while struggling with the cumbersome computer system that served as their primary database. The software required multiple screens to cross-reference information, crashed regularly, and couldn't automatically flag connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of evidence. Private investigators hired by the Wright family brought additional resources, but encountered identical obstacles. Former FBI agent Michael Torres, retained by Patricia Wright despite the significant cost, applied decades of experience to the case, but found himself constrained by the same technological limitations that frustrated law enforcement. "I've worked kidnapping cases, murder investigations, complex fraud schemes," Torres explained during a meeting with the Wright family, "but I've never encountered a disappearance this clean. No ransom demands, no witness sightings, no digital footprint. It's like Nora Wright never existed after 450. Surveillance camera networks that would become ubiquitous within a decade were practically non-existent in rural Delaware. The few businesses with security systems used analog equipment that recorded over previous footage every few days, making long-term evidence preservation nearly impossible. By the time investigators identified potentially relevant locations, crucial footage had already been erased by automated systems. The investigation's scope expanded to encompass increasingly remote possibilities as conventional leads evaporated. Detectives examined Nora's college records for any indication of academic stress, financial problems, or interpersonal conflicts that might motivate a voluntary disappearance. They found nothing more troubling than occasional struggles with organic chemistry and concerns about student loan payments, normal challenges for any undergraduate student. Financial records revealed no unusual transactions, no large cash withdrawals, no evidence of secret accounts or hidden resources that might facilitate running away. Nora's bank account contained $127.43 on the day she disappeared, hardly sufficient for establishing a new life elsewhere. Credit card statements showed typical college student purchases, textbooks, gasoline, occasional meals at inexpensive restaurants. Internet activity analysis, primitive by modern standards, revealed nothing suspicious in Nora's email communications or early social media presence. Her computer showed normal browsing patterns focused on environmental science research, hiking trail websites, and communications with classmates about group study sessions. "We've polygraphed everyone in her social circle twice," Detective Kowalski reported during a December briefing with state police supervisors. "We've searched every inch of that park, drained 3 ponds, and followed up on over 400 tips. But we're no closer to answers than we were on day 1. The case attracted attention from television crime shows, seeking compelling content for their audiences. Producers from America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries contacted Delaware State Police about featuring Nora's disappearance, but even experienced television investigators struggled to construct coherent narratives from the available evidence. False confessions began arriving as the case gained media attention, ranging from attention-seeking individuals claiming responsibility to mentally ill people convinced they had harmed Nora despite having no connection to Delaware. Each confession required thorough investigation, consuming precious investigative resources while providing no genuine leads. "We had a guy from Oregon call 3 times claiming he'd buried Nora's car in his backyard," Detective Chen recalled. "It took 2 weeks, and coordination with Portland police to definitively rule him out. Meanwhile, real leads were getting lost in the noise." Seasonal changes worked against investigative efforts as autumn progressed toward winter. Early snows covered potential evidence under blankets of white that wouldn't melt until spring, while freezing temperatures made ground searches treacherous and uncomfortable. The volunteer enthusiasm that had sustained early search efforts gradually diminished as people returned to normal routines disrupted by the initial emergency response. Professional searchers, using specialized equipment, combed the park repeatedly, employing metal detectors sensitive enough to locate coins buried decades earlier, and ground-penetrating radar capable of identifying subsurface anomalies. They found remnants of Civil War-era farming implements, lost jewelry from generations of park visitors, and underground utility lines, but nothing connected to Nora Wright's disappearance. The investigation consumed enormous resources, without generating proportional results, straining the Delaware State Police budget and diverting personnel from other cases that offered better prospects for resolution. Supervisors began making subtle suggestions about reducing the case's priority level, transitioning active investigation to periodic review status. Nobody wanted to give up, Detective Kowalski emphasized years later. But we'd exhausted every conventional investigative technique available in 2005. Without new evidence or a breakthrough in technology, there was nowhere else to go. By winter, the case was stalled. The Wright family home on Maple Street had acquired the haunted quality that settles over places where tragedy has taken up permanent residence. Patricia Wright moved through her daily routines like a sleepwalker, performing familiar tasks, while her mind remained focused on the impossible question that had consumed her life since September. Where is Nora? The porch light that had burned continuously since that first terrible night had become a neighborhood landmark by December 2005. Children walking to school pointed it out to friends, while longtime residents made slight detours during evening walks, just to confirm it still glowed in the darkness. The electric company, learning about the situation through a sympathetic meter reader, quietly waived the additional charges for the constant illumination. People would stop me in the grocery store and ask if there was any news, Patricia recalled years later, her voice still carrying the weight of those endless months of uncertainty. I appreciated their concern, but every conversation felt like reopening the wound. How do you explain to someone that your daughter has simply vanished from the earth? Christmas 2005 arrived with its usual festivities playing out around the Wright household, like life continuing in a parallel universe where happiness was still possible. Patricia mechanically went through the motions of holiday preparation, decorating the tree with ornaments Nora had made during elementary school art classes, and setting an extra place at the dinner table that remained painfully empty. The living room mantelpiece became an impromptu shrine to Nora's memory, featuring photographs from hiking trips, her graduation picture, and the environmental science award she'd received junior year. Birthday cards from friends who hadn't heard about the disappearance continued, arriving for months, each envelope delivering a fresh stab of loss, as Patricia struggled to compose responses explaining that Nora was missing. The hardest part was other people moving on with their lives, explained Linda Morrison, Patricia's sister who had essentially moved in to provide support during the crisis. Neighbors would complain about normal problems, car trouble, work stress, their kids' grades, and you wanted to scream that none of it mattered because Nora was gone, but you couldn't blame them for living their lives. Patricia established rituals that provided structure during the chaos of not knowing. Every morning, she prepared coffee for 2 people out of habit, then poured the extra cup down the sink while tears streamed down her face. She continued making Nora's favorite meals on autopilot, freezing the leftovers that accumulated like edible monuments to hope that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The missing person posters that had blanketed Newark and surrounding communities began showing weather damage as winter progressed. Patricia spent weekends replacing faded photographs and reinforcing staples loosened by rain and snow, treating the maintenance of her daughter's public presence as sacred responsibility. Store owners who had initially welcomed the displays began quietly removing damaged posters rather than asking if replacements were needed. Detective Kowalski made periodic courtesy calls to the Wright household, though he rarely had substantive updates to share. These visits became exercises in managing expectations while maintaining hope, walking the impossible line between honesty about the investigation's limitations and the family's desperate need for something approaching progress. Ray would sit at our kitchen table and go through everything one more time, Patricia remembered. He never made promises he couldn't keep, but he never gave up either. Sometimes I think those visits were harder on him than they were on us. The Delaware State Police had officially reclassified the case as suspended pending new evidence by February 2006, though Detective Kowalski continued working leads when his caseload permitted. The transition from active investigation to cold case status felt like a second death, confirming what Patricia had feared but refused to acknowledge, that the intensive search efforts had failed to locate her daughter. Support groups for families of missing persons became Patricia's primary social outlet, connecting her with other parents navigating similar impossible circumstances. These meetings provided both comfort and additional anguish, as she learned about cases that had been resolved after years of uncertainty and others that had remained mysteries for decades. "You realize that some families never get answers," Patricia observed after attending her first National Center for Missing Adults conference in Washington, D.C. "But you also meet people who waited 15-20 years before getting closure. It teaches you that hope has to be stronger than despair, even when despair feels more rational." Financial stress compounded emotional trauma, as the costs of private investigators, reward funds, and travel expenses for conferences and meetings consumed the Wright family's modest savings. Patricia had taken extended leave from her job as a bank teller, making normal income impossible, while expenses related to the search continued mounting. The University of Delaware established a small memorial scholarship in Nora's name, funded by contributions from her environmental science classmates and faculty members. The gesture provided some comfort, but also carried the unsettling implication that Nora was being remembered rather than actively sought. Patricia attended the presentation ceremony, but struggled with the finality that scholarships and memorials seemed to represent. Local media attention had shifted to other stories by spring 2006, though occasional anniversary pieces would revisit the case, with updates that invariably concluded with phrases like, "Police have no new leads," and "the investigation continues." These articles served as painful reminders that Nora's disappearance was becoming yesterday's news rather than today's priority. The porch light continued burning through seasons of change, its steady glow becoming so familiar to neighbors that they would have noticed its absence more readily than its presence. Patricia replaced bulbs when they burned out, upgraded to more energy-efficient LED fixtures, and ensured that backup power systems would keep the light operating even during electrical outages. That light meant Nora could find her way home, Patricia explained to visitors who asked about the constant illumination. As long as it was burning, there was hope that she might come walking up the driveway with some explanation for where she'd been. Years slipped by, but the light never went out. By 2010, the Nora Wright case had settled into the uncomfortable category of local legend that longtime residents referenced with knowing nods, while newcomers learned about it through carefully whispered conversations at PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues. Newark, Delaware, had grown and changed around the edges of the mystery, with new housing developments filling former farmland and young families arriving who had no personal connection to the tragedy that had once dominated local headlines. The Brandywine Creek State Park had returned to its normal rhythms of seasonal visitors and weekend hikers, though subtle changes marked the lingering impact of Nora's disappearance. Park rangers reported that fewer people chose to hike alone, particularly young women, and the solo parking spaces that Nora had once preferred often remained empty even during peak visitation periods. "You could feel the shadow of what happened," recalled Jennifer Santos, a University of Delaware student who began hiking at Brandywine Creek. And the rangers would always make a point of mentioning that someone had gone missing from these trails a few years back, and you could see it in people's faces, this recognition that beautiful places could hide dangerous secrets. Sarah Peterson, Nora's former roommate, had graduated and moved to Philadelphia for a marketing job, but she maintained regular contact with Patricia Wright and continued advocating for renewed attention to the case. She created a Facebook page dedicated to Nora's memory that accumulated several hundred followers, mostly University of Delaware alumni and Newark residents who remembered the intensive search efforts. "Every September 17th, I would post something asking people to share Nora's story," Sarah explained years later. "Social media was still pretty new, but I thought maybe someone, somewhere, might see her picture and remember something important." The missing person posters had long since disappeared from most public bulletin boards, victims of weather, renovation projects, and the natural tendency to forget tragedies that don't directly impact daily life. But Patricia Wright continued her weekly ritual of checking locations where Nora's photograph had once been displayed, occasionally requesting permission to post updated flyers that reflected her daughter's projected appearance as years passed. Detective Kowalski had retired from the Delaware State Police in 2012, though he maintained personal files on the Nora Wright case and periodically contacted his former colleagues about developments in forensic technology that might provide new investigative opportunities. His replacement, Detective Amanda Foster, inherited a case file that had grown to encompass 4 thick binders and multiple boxes of evidence that seemed to lead nowhere. Ray briefed me extensively when I took over his caseload, Detective Foster recalled. The Nora Wright file was the thickest in his desk drawer, and you could tell it haunted him. He'd followed every possible lead, interviewed every potential witness, and run every test available with 205 technology. But the case was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Advances in forensic science offered occasional hope for breakthrough developments. DNA analysis had become more sophisticated and sensitive, capable of extracting genetic profiles from increasingly degraded samples. But the Nora Wright case suffered from a fundamental problem that advanced technology couldn't solve. There was no physical evidence to analyze. We periodically reviewed the evidence inventory, Detective Foster explained during a 2015 interview. Nora's hiking boots from her closet, clothing items that might retain trace evidence, personal belongings that could theoretically yield DNA from an unknown subject. But without something to compare it against, even perfect genetic profiles don't provide answers. The case attracted occasional attention from amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who discovered it through internet searches or podcast references. These amateur sleuths often approached the investigation with fresh perspectives, but they encountered the same evidentiary limitations that had frustrated professional law enforcement for years. Online forums, dedicated to missing person cases, featured lengthy discussions about Nora Wright's disappearance, with contributors analyzing publicly available information and proposing theories ranging from plausible to bizarre. These conversations sometimes generated tips that detectives dutifully investigated, but they also spread misinformation and created false leads that consumed investigative resources. The internet was a double-edged sword, Detective Foster observed. Sometimes we'd get genuinely useful information from people who remembered details they'd forgotten to report years earlier. But we also had to chase down conspiracy theories and wild speculation that had no basis in fact. Patricia Wright had become something of an expert on missing person advocacy, serving on advisory boards for nonprofit organizations and speaking at conferences about the challenges facing families in similar situations. Her expertise came at enormous personal cost, but she channeled her pain into helping other parents navigate the bureaucratic and emotional obstacles that accompanied unexplained disappearances. The annual vigils at St. Mary's Catholic Church had evolved into broader community events focused on missing person awareness, with speakers addressing personal safety, family communication protocols, and technological resources available to help locate missing individuals. These gatherings drew smaller crowds as years passed, but core supporters continued attending faithfully, treating Nora's memory as a sacred responsibility. The vigils weren't just about Nora anymore, explained Father Michael Rodriguez, who had presided over every service since 2005. They became about all the missing, all the families who were still waiting for answers. But Nora's case was always the heart of it, the reason we gathered together to pray and remember. Local businesses that had once displayed Nora's missing person poster began treating September as an unofficial remembrance month, with subtle gestures like donating portions of sales proceeds to missing person organizations or displaying purple ribbons, the color associated with missing person awareness. These activities rarely generated media attention, but they demonstrated the lasting impact of Nora's disappearance on her community. The environmental science program at the University of Delaware had established traditions honoring Nora's memory, including an annual field trip to Brandywine Creek State Park where students conducted water quality research As part of their coursework, faculty members who remembered Nora would share stories about her enthusiasm and dedication, keeping her memory alive for new generations of students who had never met her. We wanted current students to understand that environmental science isn't just about data and research, explained Dr. Morrison, who had continued teaching long past normal retirement age. It's about people like Nora, who loved the natural world and wanted to protect it for future generations. Her passion for this work was infectious, and we wanted that passion to continue inspiring others. But what made this case truly baffling was the complete absence of any trace: no clothing, no personal belongings, no vehicle parts, no human remains. It was as if Nora Wright and her silver Honda Civic had been erased from existence with surgical precision, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. Then, nearly 2 decades later, the woods revealed a secret. The morning of March 15, 2023, dawned crisp and clear over Brandywine Creek State Park, with early spring sunlight filtering through bare branches that would soon burst with new leaves. Kevin Morrison, a trail maintenance volunteer with no relation to Nora's former professor, was conducting his monthly check of the park's more remote hiking paths when he noticed something unusual approximately 2 miles southeast of the main trail system. "I was clearing storm debris from the winter," Morrison recalled, adjusting his well-worn baseball cap as he described the discovery that would change everything. There had been some severe weather in February, and fallen trees had opened up sightlines into areas that had been completely hidden for years. What Morrison spotted was a flash of faded fabric partially buried under decades of accumulated leaves and forest debris, far from any established trail in an area so remote that most visitors never ventured in that direction. The location sat at the bottom of a steep ravine, approximately 50 yards from a seasonal stream that ran high during spring snowmelt, but remained nearly dry most of the year. Park Ranger Thompson, now a senior supervisor after 18 years of service, responded to Morrison's radio call with a mixture of professional skepticism and deeply buried hope. He had participated in dozens of searches for missing hikers over the years, but something about this discovery felt different from the typical false alarms that periodically excited volunteers and disappointed investigators. When Kevin described what he'd found, my first thought was that it was probably just trash dumped by someone taking a shortcut through the woods, Thompson explained, but the location was so remote, so difficult to access, that dumping garbage there wouldn't make any sense. The fabric Morrison had spotted turned out to be the remains of a small backpack, weathered and partially deteriorated, but still recognizable as the type of daypack favored by hikers. More significantly, the pack's location suggested that it had been concealed rather than simply dropped, buried under brush and debris in a way that could have hidden it for decades. Delaware State Police Crime Scene Unit arrived within 2 hours, treating the discovery with the meticulous care that modern forensic science demanded. Detective Foster, now a lieutenant with 15 years of experience investigating cold cases, supervised the evidence recovery with equipment and techniques that would have seemed like science fiction to investigators working the original case in. We established a proper perimeter, photographed everything in situ, and used GPS coordinates, accurate to within inches rather than yards, Lieutenant Foster explained. The technology available to us in 2023 allowed for evidence collection that was impossible 18 years earlier. The backpack itself appeared to be a standard hiking day pack, black with gray trim, showing extensive weather damage, but retaining enough structural integrity to suggest it hadn't been exposed to the elements for the full 18-year period. More intriguingly, the pack's shoulder straps showed what appeared to be deliberate concealment efforts, branches woven through the webbing and leaves stuffed into exterior pockets. Someone had tried to hide this pack, observed crime scene technician Maria Santos, daughter of the former sergeant who had worked the original case. The pattern of concealment was too systematic to be natural weathering or animal activity. Initial field examination revealed that the pack was empty of obvious personal items, but modern forensic techniques could extract evidence from sources that previous generations of investigators couldn't access. Touch DNA analysis, unknown in 2005, could potentially identify genetic material from skin cells transferred during normal handling of fabric surfaces. The backpack was transported to the Delaware State Police Forensic Laboratory in a sterile evidence container, where technicians began the painstaking process of DNA extraction, using equipment that cost more than the entire annual budget for the original Nora Wright investigation. The analysis required several weeks as technicians worked with degraded genetic material that had been exposed to years of environmental conditions. DNA technology has advanced exponentially since 2005, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic laboratory's chief geneticist. We can now extract usable genetic profiles from samples that would have been considered worthless 20 years ago. Touch DNA, mitochondrial analysis, and improved amplification techniques give us capabilities that seem almost magical compared to earlier methods. The laboratory's computer systems automatically compared any extracted DNA profiles against multiple databases, including the FBI's Combined DNA Index System (GEODIS), state databases, and genealogical websites that had revolutionized forensic identification during the 20s. These databases contained millions of genetic profiles that could potentially identify unknown DNA or establish familial relationships with unprecedented precision. On April 3, 2023, Dr. Walsh called Lieutenant Foster with results that sent shockwaves through the Delaware State Police. The DNA extracted from the backpack's shoulder strap matched a profile already in the system, but not from a criminal database. The genetic material belonged to someone who had submitted DNA for genealogical research, creating a digital breadcrumb trail that led investigators directly to an identity. When Jennifer called me with the results, I had to ask her to repeat everything twice, Lieutenant Foster recalled. After 18 years of dead ends, we finally had a name attached to physical evidence from what appeared to be Nora Wright's final hiking trip. But what the DNA matched sent shockwaves through Delaware and beyond. The DNA profile extracted from the weathered backpack created an immediate crisis of disbelief within the Delaware State Police Forensic Laboratory. Walsh ran the analysis 3 separate times using different equipment and protocols, each iteration confirming results that seemed to challenge the fundamental assumptions that had guided the Nora Wright investigation for nearly 2 decades. The genetic profile belonged to Thomas Brennan, Lieutenant Foster announced during an emergency briefing with state police supervisors and the Delaware Attorney General's office. 67 years old, retired maintenance supervisor, lifelong Newark resident. More importantly, he was one of the volunteer searchers who participated in the original efforts to find Nora Wright. Thomas Brennan had been a familiar face during the intensive search operations in September 2005, showing up daily with coffee for exhausted volunteers and local knowledge about unofficial trails and remote areas within Brandywine Creek State Park. At 50 years old during the original investigation, he had been considered a community asset rather than a potential suspect, exactly the type of concerned citizen that missing person cases depend upon for volunteer support. Tom was everybody's idea of a helpful neighbor, recalled Patricia Wright when detectives informed her about the DNA match. He organized search teams, brought food for volunteers, and stayed late to help with logistics. The idea that he might have been involved in Nora's disappearance was absolutely incomprehensible. Brennan had lived in Newark for over 40 years, working for the Delaware Department of Transportation before retiring his personnel records showed no disciplinary actions, his background check revealed no criminal history beyond minor traffic violations, and his neighbors universally described him as quiet, reliable. He had been married to the same woman for 35 years, raised 2 children who had become successful professionals, and volunteered regularly with local charities. This is every investigator's nightmare scenario, Lieutenant Foster explained to the Attorney General's staff. Our suspect didn't just blend into the community, he was the community. Tom Brennan represented everything people trust about small-town Delaware life. Modern genealogical DNA analysis had identified Brennan through genetic material submitted to a commercial ancestry website by one of his adult children, who was researching family history with no knowledge that the DNA profile would eventually connect their father to an 18-year-old missing person case. The identification process that had once required months or years of traditional detective work was accomplished within hours by computer algorithms comparing genetic markers across millions of profiles. The genealogical DNA match was incredibly precise, Dr. Walsh explained during the investigation briefing. We're not talking about distant familial relationships that require interpretation. This was direct DNA evidence placing Thomas Brennan in physical contact with evidence from the crime scene. Surveillance teams immediately began monitoring Brennan's daily activities, while investigators developed strategies for confronting a suspect who had successfully concealed his involvement for nearly 2 decades. The 77-year-old retiree maintained regular routines that included morning walks, afternoon visits to the local library, and weekly dinner outings with his wife at family restaurants where staff knew their preferred table and usual orders. Watching Tom Brennan go about his daily life was surreal, observed Detective Marcus Thompson, assigned to the surveillance team. He seemed like any other grandfather, reading newspapers at McDonald's, chatting with neighbors about their gardens, complaining about the weather. There was nothing that suggested he was capable of the violence we suspected. The investigation team faced delicate decisions about how to proceed with questioning Brennan while preserving evidence and avoiding community panic. News of a breakthrough in the Nora Wright case would inevitably leak, but premature disclosure could compromise the investigation or allow Brennan to destroy evidence that might still exist after 18 years. Background investigation into Brennan's activities during 2005 revealed patterns that had been invisible to investigators focused on conventional suspects. His Department of Transportation work had provided detailed knowledge of Delaware's rural road networks, including maintenance access routes and abandoned facilities that weren't marked on standard maps. His volunteer activities with search and rescue organizations had given him expertise in wilderness navigation and evidence concealment techniques. Tom knew exactly where search teams would look, because he helped organize the search. Lieutenant Foster realized during strategy meetings. He understood our protocols, our equipment limitations, and our blind spots better than we did. Property records showed that Brennan owned a small cabin near the Delaware-Maryland border, purchased in 1998, and used primarily for hunting and fishing expeditions. The remote location had never been searched during the original investigation because it was outside the geographic focus area, and Brennan had been considered a helpful volunteer rather than a potential suspect. Digital forensics teams began analyzing Brennan's internet history, financial records, and communication patterns for evidence of suspicious activity during September 2005 or subsequent years. The investigation benefited from data preservation practices that were routine by 2023, but had been practically non-existent in 2005, creating a digital archaeological record of activities that previous investigators couldn't access. We found deleted internet searches from 2005 and 2006 related to evidence disposal, body decomposition, and DNA detection methods, digital forensics specialist Rachel Kim reported during the investigation briefing. The searches were conducted from Thomas Brennan's home computer during the weeks following Nora Wright's disappearance. Cell phone records from 2005, preserved in company archives that had once seemed destined for deletion, revealed that Brennan's phone had ping towers near Brandywine Creek State Park during the afternoon of September, despite his statements to investigators that he had been home watching television that Saturday. The accumulated evidence painted a disturbing picture of calculated deception that had allowed Brennan to hide in plain sight for 18 years, participating in search efforts for a victim whose disappearance he had orchestrated, comforting a grieving family while concealing his responsibility for their pain. Thomas Brennan didn't just commit a crime, Lieutenant Foster observed as the arrest warrant was prepared. He weaponized the entire community's compassion and grief to provide cover for his actions. That level of manipulation is almost more disturbing than the original violence. An arrest warrant was signed. The arrest of Thomas Brennan unfolded like a precision military operation on the morning of May 8, 2023, as Delaware State Police tactical teams surrounded his modest ranch house on Elm Street at precisely. The timing was calculated to minimize neighborhood disruption while ensuring maximum tactical advantage, though no amount of planning could have prepared investigators for the community reaction that would follow. Lieutenant Foster approached the front door accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and Detective Thompson, who had spent weeks studying Brennan's routines and psychological profile. The 77-year-old suspect answered their knock wearing a terry cloth bathrobe and house slippers, his gray hair disheveled from sleep and his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something approaching resignation as Foster displayed the arrest warrant. "Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Nora Wright," Foster announced in the formal tone required by law, though her voice carried undertones of satisfaction earned through 18 years of cold case investigation. "You have the right to remain silent." Brennan's wife, Margaret, emerged from the kitchen where she had been preparing coffee for their usual morning routine, her face registering shock that would soon transform into the defensive disbelief that characterizes family members confronted with unthinkable accusations against loved ones. "There's been some terrible mistake," Margaret Brennan insisted, her hands trembling as she clutched a coffee mug like a talisman against the surreal nightmare unfolding in her living room. "Tom was helping search for that poor girl. He spent weeks looking for her. This is absolutely impossible." The search of Brennan's property yielded evidence that investigators had been seeking for nearly 2 decades, hidden in plain sight within the ordinary domestic landscape of a middle-class Delaware home. In the garage, forensic technicians discovered a plastic storage container concealed behind Christmas decorations, containing items that had belonged to Nora Wright, her hiking boots, water bottle, and digital camera, preserved like trophies from his crime. Finding Nora's personal belongings was both vindication and heartbreak. Lieutenant Foster explained during the subsequent press briefing, "We finally had the physical evidence we'd been seeking, but it also confirmed our worst fears about what had happened to her." The digital camera proved particularly significant, containing photographs that Nora had taken during her final hike before encountering Brennan on that September afternoon in 2005. The images showed normal hiking documentation, scenic views, interesting rock formations, wildflowers, but the final photograph captured something far more sinister, a partial view of a man approaching through the trees, his face obscured, but his clothing and build consistent with Thomas Brennan's appearance 18 years earlier. Advanced computer enhancement of the photograph revealed details invisible to 2005 technology, including distinctive wear patterns on boots that matched pairs found in Brennan's closet and a partially visible tattoo on his forearm that corresponded to military service records from his youth. "Nora essentially photographed her own killer," observed Dr. Sarah Martinez, the digital forensics specialist, who enhanced the crucial image. The timestamp shows this picture was taken at 4:23 p.m. on September 17, 2005, 8 minutes after her final cell phone ping. Under interrogation, Brennan initially maintained his innocence, claiming the DNA evidence had been planted and the personal belongings were items he had found during search activities and forgotten to turn over to investigators. But as detectives presented the accumulated evidence, digital forensics, enhanced photographs, preserved internet searches about evidence disposal, his story began unraveling under pressure. The interrogation lasted 14 hours over 2 days. Detective Thompson recalled, "Tom would maintain his innocence for hours, then slip and reveal knowledge about details that were never made public. He knew things that only Nora's killer could know." The confession, when it finally came, revealed a crime that was both random and calculated. Brennan had been hiking in remote areas of Brandywine Creek State Park when he encountered Nora Wright, taking photographs near the seasonal stream where her backpack would eventually be discovered. What began as a casual conversation had escalated when Brennan made inappropriate advances that Nora firmly rejected. He claimed it was an accident, that she fell and hit her head when she tried to run away. Lieutenant Foster explained to Patricia Wright during the painful briefing, where Nora's mother finally learned the truth about her daughter's final moments. But the evidence suggests something far more deliberate and violent. Brennan had used his knowledge of the park's geography and his Department of Transportation access routes to transport Nora's body and vehicle to a remote location near the Delaware Bay, where both had been buried in a construction site that was subsequently developed into a shopping center. The concrete parking lot of a popular retail complex now covered the final resting place of both Nora Wright and her silver Honda Civic. The shopping center was under construction during fall 2005, explained Delaware Department of Transportation Records Specialist Jennifer Walsh. Tom had legitimate access to the site as part of his job responsibilities, and he could move earth-moving equipment without attracting attention. The revelation that Nora's remains lay beneath a busy shopping center, where thousands of Delaware residents shopped weekly, added another layer of horror to an already devastating case. Plans were immediately developed for respectful recovery operations that would require extensive coordination with business owners, construction contractors, and forensic anthropologists. Community reaction to Brennan's arrest ranged from shock to anger, to a profound sense of betrayal that would take years to process fully. The man who had been trusted with organizing search efforts, who had comforted grieving family members, who had been considered a pillar of Newark's close-knit community, had been the monster they had been seeking all along. Everyone felt violated, recalled Father Rodriguez, who had presided over years of vigils and prayer services, while Brennan attended as a concerned community member. It wasn't just that he had committed murder, it was that he had perverted our grief, weaponized our compassion, and made us all unwilling accomplices in concealing his crime. Margaret Brennan filed for divorce within a week of her husband's arrest, though she would spend years grappling with questions about warning signs she might have missed, and whether the man she had lived with for 35 years had been a stranger all along. I keep thinking about all the times he comforted me when I was upset about Nora Wright's disappearance, Margaret told investigators during follow-up interviews. He would hold me while I cried about that poor family's loss, and now I know he was the one responsible for their pain. I don't think I'll ever understand how someone could be so cruel. Justice was finally within reach. The Commonwealth of Delaware versus Thomas Brennan opened on February 12, 2024, in Newcastle County Superior Court, with Judge Catherine Morrison presiding over proceedings that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted a community for nearly 2 decades. The courtroom overflowed with spectators, including family members, former volunteers from the original search efforts, and Delaware residents, who had followed the case since Nora Wright's disappearance. Patricia Wright, now 73 years old, sat in the front row wearing a purple ribbon, the symbol of missing persons awareness, pinned to her black suit jacket. The 18 years of uncertainty had aged her beyond her chronological years, but her eyes held a steely determination to witness justice for her daughter, even though that justice could never restore what had been lost. This trial represents more than just legal proceedings. Prosecutor Delaware Attorney General Sarah Mitchell announced during her opening statement. It represents our commitment to victims, to families, and to the principle that no crime, no matter how carefully concealed, will escape the reach of justice forever. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 2 weeks, presenting evidence that read like a masterclass in modern forensic investigation. Walsh testified about the DNA analysis that had identified Brennan, while digital forensic specialists explained how deleted computer files and enhanced photographs had provided crucial evidence unavailable during the original investigation. The defendant didn't just kill Nora Wright, Prosecutor Mitchell explained to the jury during her presentation of evidence. He spent 18 years participating in the emotional torture of her family, attending vigils for a victim whose murder he had committed, comforting people whose grief he had caused. Defense attorney Michael Torres, ironically, the same private investigator who had once worked for the Wright family, argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial and that his client's confession had been coerced through psychological pressure during lengthy interrogations. But the Manuit evidence painted such a comprehensive picture of guilt that the defense strategy focused primarily on avoiding the death penalty rather than establishing innocence. Expert testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of Brennan's deception, including his use of volunteer search activities to monitor investigation progress and his manipulation of community sympathy to deflect suspicion from his activities. Criminal psychologist Amanda Foster explained how predators often insert themselves into victim assistance activities as a form of psychological control and risk management. Thomas Brennan didn't just commit murder, Dr. Foster testified. He committed what I would characterize as extended psychological warfare against an entire community, using their compassion and grief as weapons against them. The recovery of Nora's remains from beneath the shopping center parking lot had required a complex operation involving forensic anthropologists, construction specialists, and grief counselors for family members who finally received confirmation of what they had feared for 18 years. Rebecca Martinez, the forensic anthropologist who supervised the recovery, testified about evidence of traumatic injury that supported the prosecution's murder charges. Patricia Wright's victim impact statement, delivered on the trial's final day, provided one of the most powerful moments in Delaware courtroom history. Speaking directly to Brennan, who sat impassively at the defense table, she described nearly 2 decades of anguish, false hope, and unanswered questions that had consumed her life. "You didn't just kill my daughter," Patricia said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "You killed my faith in humanity, my ability to trust neighbors, my belief that good people could be recognized by their actions. You made me question every kindness, every gesture of sympathy, every person who claimed to care about finding Nora." But Patricia's statement also emphasized resilience and the power of community support that had sustained her family through the darkest period of their lives. She thanked the investigators who had never given up, the volunteers who had sacrificed their time for a stranger's daughter, and the technological advances that had finally provided answers. Nora loved the natural world and wanted to protect it for future generations, Patricia concluded. "In her memory, I want this case to remind people that justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. Families like mine will never stop fighting for truth, and science will continue advancing until every mystery can be solved." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Judge Morrison sentenced Brennan to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for the related charges. "Thomas Brennan, you have been convicted of one of the most heinous and calculated crimes in Delaware history," Judge Morrison stated during sentencing. "Your actions demonstrate not just violence, but a profound betrayal of community trust that compounds the horror of your crimes." Community healing began even before the trial's conclusion, with support groups forming to help residents process their feelings of betrayal and violation. St. Mary's Catholic Church organized special services focused on forgiveness and restoration, while mental health professionals provided counseling for people struggling with the revelation that a trusted neighbor had been concealing such terrible secrets. The environmental science program at the University of Delaware announced plans for the Nora Wright Memorial Research Station at Brandywine Creek State Park, where students would conduct ongoing studies of water quality and ecosystem health in the area where Nora had planned to focus her senior thesis research. Nora's passion for environmental protection will continue inspiring future generations of scientists, Dr. Morrison announced at the memorial dedication ceremony. Her legacy won't be defined by how she died, but by how she lived and what she hoped to accomplish. But the case leaves lessons for all. 23 years after Nora Wright laced up her hiking boots for what should have been a routine afternoon in nature, her story stands as both a testament to the persistence of justice and a sobering reminder that evil often wears familiar faces. The young woman who dreamed of protecting Delaware's waterways through environmental science has become a symbol of how modern technology can illuminate truths that seemed permanently lost to time. The Wright case revolutionized missing person investigations across Delaware and beyond, demonstrating how advances in DNA analysis, digital forensics, and genealogical research can breathe new life into cold cases that once seemed unsolvable. Police departments nationwide have requested training based on the investigative techniques that finally brought Thomas Brennan to justice, while forensic laboratories have adopted protocols pioneered during the evidence analysis that cracked this decades-old mystery. Patricia Wright, now 74, has channeled her grief into advocacy work with the National Center for Missing Adults, helping other families navigate the impossible terrain of unexplained disappearances. The porch light that burned for 18 years has finally been extinguished, replaced by solar-powered memorial garden lights that illuminate a small shrine dedicated to missing persons from across the region. But perhaps the most important lesson from Nora's story concerns the dangerous assumption that predators can be identified by their appearance, behavior, or community standing. Thomas Brennan's ability to hide in plain sight for nearly 2 decades, actually participating in efforts to find his own victim, challenges every comfortable belief about recognizing danger and trusting neighbors. The case serves as a reminder that evil rarely announces itself with obvious warning signs, that monsters often cultivate reputations as helpful community members, and that the most dangerous predators may be those who understand how to weaponize society's compassion and grief for their own protection. Yet Nora's legacy refuses to be defined by the darkness that claimed her life. The memorial research station that bears her name has already produced significant findings about water quality in Delaware's state parks, contributing to conservation efforts that would have delighted the young scientist who loved exploring nature's hidden secrets. Environmental science students, conducting research at Brandywine Creek State Park, carry forward her passion for protecting the natural world, ensuring that her dreams survive even though her life was cut tragically short. Nora's light guided investigators for 2 decades, until justice finally answered.